farmstead somewhere between Kansas and Nebraska, the summer of 1936, the driest year the plains had seen in a generation. The sky to the west has gone the color of a fresh bruise, thick and low and moving fast. And out past the barn, the windmill wheel is spinning hard enough that the tower itself has started to hum. A sound you can feel through the soles of your boots before you ever hear it with your ears. Inside the house, a man named Orval Teague stands at the window with his hand already on the door latch. His well has been giving him less water every week for a month straight, the stock tank dropping by the inch. And a wind this strong, if he can just get out there and lock the wheel open instead of letting it furl shut the second the gusts pick up past a certain point, might pump enough in the next 20 minutes to fill that tank for the first time all week. His wife tells him to leave it be, that no amount of water is worth walking out under a sky like that one, that the mill has stood through worse blows than this and would still be standing come morning, whether he touched the lever or not. He goes anyway, because a man who has watched his cattle go 3 days on a half-full tank does not weigh a short walk to the windmill, the same way a man with plenty of water sitting in reserve would weigh it. He reaches the base of the tower just as the first fork of lightning splits the sky over the west pasture, close enough that the thunder arrives on its heels instead of trailing behind it the way a distant storm's thunder usually does. Here's the twist, friend. Orval Teague believed, the same as most men on this stretch of prairie believed, that a properly grounded windmill was about the safest thing standing on his whole farm in a storm. The record says he was wrong, and the reason he was wrong is the whole subject of this video. I'm Amos Whitfield, 5th generation on Whitfield land between Kansas and Nebraska, tending the same stretch of ground my people broke more than a century ago. My grandfather Homer kept a journal from 1934 until the year he died, in handwriting that got smaller and more careful whenever a given entry was hard to write. And the story you just heard is close kin to one he wrote down himself about a neighbor, in language plain enough that I've carried it with me my whole life since the first time I read that page as a boy. If you're new here, go ahead and hit subscribe, because we spend our time exactly in this gap, between what a family believed kept them safe and what the record actually shows once you go looking for it properly. This isn't a countdown today, friend. This is one myth, and I'd argue it likely cost this stretch of country more storm season after storm season than the drought itself ever managed to take in a single afternoon. Let's start with what every windmill owner on the plains believed they knew cold, because most of it, on its face, sounded like plain common sense. A windmill was, without much argument, the single most valuable machine on a Dust Bowl homestead. It turned wind, which cost nothing and never once ran short even in the driest years, into water pumped up from wherever the water table happened to be hiding that season, and during the worst drought this country's farmland ever saw. That water was the difference between a herd that lived and a herd that didn't. The design itself had been refined for the better part of 80 years by the time the Dust Bowl hit, going back to Daniel Halliday's original patent in the 1850s, and refined through companies like Air Motor, Eclipse, and Flint and Walling, each one competing to build a wheel that could pump reliably through a Kansas summer without shaking itself to pieces. Families understood the machine had one real enemy, and it wasn't lightning. It was itself. A windmill wheel spinning unchecked in a genuine gale could tear its own gearing apart, or fold its sails back over the tower like a closing hand, which is exactly why every design going back to those first Halliday patents built in some kind of automatic safety. A spring-loaded tail vane pulled the whole wheel sideways out of the face of the wind the moment gusts climbed past somewhere around 25 to 30 miles an hour, furling it closed the same way a man might turn his shoulder into a hard wind to take less of it square in the chest. That system worked, and every family that owned one trusted it completely. The same unthinking trust you'd put in a door hinge or a well rope. Here's what most owners also knew, and used freely, because it was built into the machine on purpose for entirely legitimate reasons. That same furling cable could be locked down from the ground, on purpose, to hold the wheel open and pumping even as the wind climbed past the point where the mill would otherwise have shut itself down automatically. Manufacturers built that lockout in for routine service, so a man could stop the wheel entirely to grease a fitting, true up a bent vane, or work on the pump rod down inside the casing without the wheel catching a gust and taking his hand off at the wrist. But a family, in the worst weeks of a drought, watching a stock tank drop by the inch with cattle standing in the yard bawling for water, had every reason in the world to use that same lockout the opposite way, holding the wheel open through rising wind instead of shutting it down, squeezing every extra gallon out of a storm system that might not blow through again for another 2 weeks. It felt like good sense. It felt like exactly the kind of resourcefulness this whole channel is built on celebrating. And as for the storm itself, most families believed a solid ground wire run down one leg of the tower into the dirt took care of the real danger entirely. Lightning would find the ground it was looking for. The thinking went, and slide harmlessly past a man standing safely off to one side, same as water, running off a tin roof. First pattern break, friend, because everything I've told you so far was reasonable. And every piece of it was also wrong in a way nobody on the plains had the instruments to catch. I don't want to leave you thinking every piece of prairie stormcraft from this era was wrong, because most of it wasn't, and it's worth saying so plainly before we go any further. Families on this land got remarkably good at reading a sky before it turned dangerous, watching the particular shade a cloud bank took on before a real gust front arrived, feeling the sudden drop in temperature that came a good 10 or 15 minutes ahead of a serious blow, listening to the way birds went quiet and low before the first gust ever reached the yard. The same way a dog will go still and alert before its owner has noticed a thing. That knowledge was sound, tested over generations of watching this exact sky, and it gave a family real warning time before a storm arrived, often enough to get stock into a shed and children into a cellar with minutes to spare before the worst of it hit. The mistake was never in reading the storm correctly. The mistake was in what a family decided to do with that warning once they had it. And for too many families, the decision was to spend those precious few minutes of warning walking toward the tallest metal object on the property instead of away from it. A windmill tower on open prairie ground running 30 to 40 feet into open sky with nothing else standing anywhere near it for a quarter mile in any direction is close to a textbook definition of what modern lightning science calls a preferred strike point, the tallest and most electrically attractive object for a considerable distance in every direction. Historical accounts of the windmill era are blunt about it, describing the tall wooden and steel towers scattered across the plains as acting like lightning rods in their own right. And no small number of them were destroyed outright by fire after a direct hit. Towers and wheels both burned to the footing in a matter of minutes, while a family watched helpless from the porch. A ground wire run down one leg genuinely did help protect the machine itself, giving a strike somewhere to go besides straight through the gearbox and down into the well casing. It did essentially nothing to protect a man standing at the base of that same tower. Because a lightning strike does not travel neatly down a single wire and simply vanish into the earth directly underneath it the moment it touches ground. The current spreads outward through the soil itself in every direction from the strike point, sometimes for 100 feet or more depending on ground moisture and composition, and anyone standing, or worse, kneeling to work a stuck lever. Anywhere within that radius can be struck by what today's meteorologists call ground current or a side flash, electricity. Finding a path through a human body simply because that body happened to be standing on charged earth at the wrong moment. Modern lightning safety guidance, published today by the National Weather Service and reinforced in agricultural extension safety bulletins across the Plains states, is direct about this exact scenario. Grounding protects equipment. It does not make a tall, isolated structure a safe place for a human being to stand near during a storm, grounded or not. And the guidance specifically names isolated farm structures like windmills as places to get away from the moment thunder first becomes audible, not places to work or even to admire from a comfortable distance. And that lockout cable, the one that felt like resourcefulness, carried its own separate danger that had nothing to do with lightning at all. A second layer to this same myth that most families never connected to the first. A wheel held open by force into wind stronger than the mill was ever designed to run against does not simply spin a little faster and pump a little more water in a straight, predictable line. Past a certain point, the sails themselves, whether wood slat on an older mill or galvanized steel on a newer one, begin absorbing far more force than the gearing, the crank arm, and the tower bolts were ever engineered to carry, and something eventually gives, often without much warning beyond a change in the pitch of that hum you could feel through your boots. Sometimes it was the sucker rod down inside the well casing, snapping under the strain and dropping the whole pump mechanism to the bottom of the hole, ruining the well for weeks until somebody could fish it back out. Sometimes it was a single sail tearing loose entirely, a heavy curved piece of galvanized steel released into open air at considerable speed. At the exact moment, a man happened to be standing at the base of the tower, fighting with a stuck lockout lever with both hands and his eyes on the mechanism instead of the sky above him. The very same storm that made the extra water worth chasing was, mechanically speaking, the storm most likely to break the machine apart, while somebody stood directly underneath it, working the very lever that was holding the danger open. To be fair to the men who built these machines, most manufacturer service manuals from companies like Air Motor and Flint and Walling did warn against exactly this practice, printed right there in the fine print alongside the greasing schedule and the bolt torque specifications. The trouble is that a manual printed and shipped once with a new mill rarely survived intact through a decade of dust, weather, and secondhand sales between neighbors. And a family running a mill their grandfather had bought new in 1908 was working from memory and habit. Passed down by word of mouth, not from a pamphlet that had likely gone to dust in a drawer, somewhere 2 owners back. The warning existed. It simply didn't travel as far, or as reliably, as the machine itself did. Second pattern break. I want to be honest with you about something here, friend, because it matters more than almost anything else in this video, and it's the reason this particular story is harder to tell cleanly than some of the others on this channel. Nobody in the 1930s was keeping a careful, centralized count of how many Plains families lost someone to a windmill in a storm. There was no federal agency logging lightning fatalities by specific cause the way there is today. No national database cross-referencing storm dates against county death certificates, nothing resembling the kind of clean statistical record we'd want for a video like this one. A death out at the base of a tower during a thunderstorm on an isolated section of prairie, miles from the nearest doctor and sometimes miles from the nearest neighbor who might have seen it happen, often simply got written into a county record as an accident, plain and unadorned, or folded into a general accounting of storm deaths for that season without the specific cause ever making it any further than a local paper's back page, if it made the paper at all. What we have instead is exactly what I open this video with. A pattern repeated often enough in family journals, county histories, and local newspaper morgues across 6 states that historians who study the windmill era treat it as an accepted, well-understood hazard of the age, even without a clean national number attached to it the way we might want for a topic like this. I won't pretend to you that I have a body count to hand you, because I don't. And any channel that gave you one with real confidence would be making it up. What I can tell you is that the pattern is real, repeated, and documented enough in scattered local records that it wasn't considered unusual or remarkable at the time. It was considered simply the kind of thing that happened to a man now and again, the way losing a finger to a corn picker was considered the kind of thing that happened to a man now and again. Homer's own journal names one neighbor by name in connection with a story almost identical to the one I opened this video with. I won't repeat that name here out of respect for the family, but the shape of what he wrote down that week is the same shape I gave you at the start of this video, close enough word for word that I still get a chill reading his page whenever I open that particular year. Which brings us back to Orville Teague, standing at the base of his own tower as the first fork of lightning splits the sky. In the version of this story that Homer's journal tells, the man reaches up, throws the lockout lever to hold the wheel open, and takes 2 steps back toward the house exactly as a second closer strike hits a fence post 40 yards off. Close enough that the ground current traveling out from it knocks him flat on his back in the dirt. Stunned. Ears ringing. The smell of scorched earth thick in his nose, alive by nothing but the distance between himself and that fence post and a few feet of dry ground that happened to conduct less than the wetter soil closer to the strike. He did not walk away from that night unconvinced. Friend. He walked away from it having relearned the hard way something his own father almost certainly already knew and never quite managed to pass down to him in a way that stuck before it was too late to matter. A windmill was worth chasing water out of. It was never worth standing under a strike coming for the tallest thing on the property. I want to be straight with you about one more thing before I close this out. A few summers back, I drove out to a section of Mercer County where an old air motor mill still stands on a foundation nobody's farmed around in decades, rusted solid, wheel long since seized in place. I stood at the base of it on a clear, still afternoon, just to get a feel for the scale of the thing. 30-some feet of steel tower with nothing else standing within sight of it in any direction. Corn stubble running flat in every direction as far as I could see. It is a genuinely different feeling to stand under something like that with your own eyes than it is to read the number in a safety pamphlet or hear a man on a video tell you about it secondhand. You understand standing there exactly why the old accounts describe these towers the way they do. There is nothing else for a strike to choose, nothing to share the sky with for a quarter mile. And the tower does not care whether the day is clear or whether a storm is bearing down on it. It simply stands there, waiting, the same as it always has. I'll say the honest thing plainly, the way I try to on this channel every time. Windmills still stand across the plains today, plenty of them, still pumping. And the advice hasn't changed in 90 years, even though the science behind it has gotten a great deal more precise since Orval Teague's night. If a storm is close enough to hear, you get away from the tower, away from the fence wire running off it, away from anything tall and metal and alone in open country, and you do not go back until it has genuinely passed, and the count between the flash and the thunder has stretched back out to something safe. The water can wait another 20 minutes. A family cannot wait on a man who didn't. Comment down below and tell me if your own family kept a windmill and whether a story like this one ever got passed down about it, true or half remembered or turned into something closer to a ghost story by the time it reached you 2 or 3 generations later. Maybe it's a scorch mark somebody's grandfather pointed out on an old fence post and never fully explained. Maybe it's a mill that still stands rusted on a corner of the property nobody quite trusts to climb anymore, for reasons nobody in the family can name outright. I read every single comment, and the story that shows up most often is the one I build the next video around. So here's the whole of it laid out straight, friend. The way I think Homer would have wanted it laid out. The danger everybody understood, a wheel spinning itself apart in a gale, was real. And every safety feature built into these machines over 80 years of design answered that exact fear. Honestly and well, refined by companies competing hard against each other to build the mill that wouldn't shake itself to pieces in a hard Kansas wind. The danger that actually did the most killing crept in sideways, through a ground wire that only ever promised to protect the machine, never the man standing beside it, and through a lockout lever that felt like grit and resourcefulness right up until the moment it wasn't either one of those things anymore. That is the pattern this whole channel keeps circling back to, video after video, and I don't think it's an accident that it keeps showing up in one form or another. The thread a family already understood, the one with a name and a shape and 80 years of hard-won engineering built against it, was almost never the one that needed the warning label. It was the one sitting quietly behind the belief that being careful and being safe were always the same thing, when in fact a man could do everything by the book. Ground the tower properly. Trust the lockout, the way the manufacturer intended, and still be standing in exactly the wrong spot the one time it mattered most. If you take one piece of this out into your own life, let it be this: whether you've got a windmill standing on your place today or not, ask what a safety feature was actually built to protect, the machine or the person standing next to it, because those two answers aren't always the same one. And the gap between them is exactly where trouble likes to stand and wait for somebody in a hurry. Next time on this channel, I'll walk you through the 2-cent trick that kept a whole county's seed corn alive through a drought. The Extension Office swore could not be beaten, and the exact year the hybrid seed companies made sure nobody would ever need to remember it again. I'm Amos Whitfield, and thank you kindly for listening.